So if I may introduce Dr. Ruth Bancewicz, and she is our Director of Church Engagement here in the Faraday Institute. And her talk this morning is entitled, Where Are We Going? Engaging with Science Well in a Church Context. So Ruth, properly over to you now.
Thank you. Have I flicked the switch the right direction? Or the alternative title that I've given myself is Worshipping God with Science. And my background is in genetics a long time ago, but now I find myself helping churches to think about science and faith. And what I'm going to do now is try and give you an overview of how we can engage with science well in a church context. And I'll touch on all sorts of areas that you'll then hear about in a lot more depth later on. So here's a little outline of where we're going. I'm going to talk about how science and faith can interact together in a positive way, how different ways in which churches can engage with science just as part of their regular activities. And then I'll give you some examples of what some churches have been doing just to inspire you. So, let's start. Thinking about how science and faith work together, it's always best to start by defining what science is, isn't it? Science is about anything you can weigh, anything you can measure, anything you can observe, then you can do something scientific, some scientific activities. Science is about trying to figure out general principles about the things you're looking at. Are all swans white or not? Wanting to come up with mathematical descriptions of things. It's also quite a creative endeavour, whether that's getting a machine to work, getting an experimental protocol to work, or whether it's coming up with new ideas for ways to look at the world and testing them. It's quite imaginative. You have to plan into the future. You have to come up with different ways of sorting and processing information. It's quite intuitive at times, although you always have to test your intuition with experiments. It's always provisional. If it's not something that can't be disproved, it's generally not science. We're always trying to find ways to reduce our bias because we're human. We collaborate together. Scientists as individuals may not always be the most sociable people, but they have to learn to be as sociable as possible because science is very collaborative. We have to review each other's work, put it through all sorts of filters, and hopefully the aim is that the scientific endeavour is getting nearer to the truth. It's a lot of fun, it's difficult, we get on with it. So for example, if you're looking at a coral reef, kinds of scientific questions you can ask about that. What creatures are there? What are they like? What do they do? How do they interact? Are they in creatures I can't see? Is there anything microscopic going on there? Anything submicroscopic? What nutrients and things are coming in? What waste products and what have you are coming out? How are human interactions affecting it? Those are all scientific questions. What's it worth? It's not a scientific question. What should we do with it? It's not a scientific question. That doesn't mean they're not important questions. You just need to go to other areas to answer them. So, thinking about those wider questions and being church leaders, I will assume you're all comfortable with a little bit of theology. And there's a lot of assumptions behind the way that a Christian will approach the world. First of all, this came up in conversation over coffee. Everything is God's. It's all His. So in a sense, there's no great big divide or gulf between science and religion. There's the natural, supernatural divide I don't find terribly helpful. I think that's something people impose onto Christianity or onto the Bible. Sometimes it's useful language to sort of shortcut when we're talking about some processes, but on the whole, I try and avoid it. The idea that God is rational, that we are made in His image. We can think too, we have minds, and that we are here in the world to take care of it. and the ways in which science might complement theology. You could describe it in several ways. You could talk about God's revealed knowledge of his purposes through the Bible, through his interactions with his people, through his interactions with the church over the millennia. And then there's another level of scientific knowledge about creation. Or you could talk about God as the primary cause of everything and the root and origin of everything, and that scientists are studying secondary causes. So we're studying the mechanisms by which things happen, which were started and are kept going by God's primary cause. And I've included a little tangent there in my text, saying that the secondary causes include random or unpredictable events. And this is quite a biggie for the science and religion discussion. And if you're interested, I would recommend going onto the Faraday website and searching for Russell Coburn, Cowburn, who has spoken about this. He's a nanotechnologist and basically saying that random events in a scientific sense, in that they're unpredictable, are our friend, in the sense that they can produce events that are unpredictable, such as the movement of atoms of air in this room, can produce very predictable outcomes, such as the temperature of things in this room. Anyway, you can look into that, but that's a tangent that's worth mentioning, I think. Or at the very simplest level, we can talk about meaning and mechanism. So when we're thinking about theology, we're thinking about meanings and purposes and whys are we here and what should we do and what are things for. And when we're thinking about science, we're thinking about mechanisms. How does that happen? How do they interact with each other? What can I predict will happen if I do it again? So that's how science complements theology. And also there's the assumption that we should be doing science and we should be using scientific knowledge in good ways. So those are the kinds of things that a Christian is bringing to the table when we're thinking about science and to faith. So for example, the mobile phone in your pocket is incredibly smart if you have a smartphone, and I hope you haven't switched off. But for the duration of the course, I'm not a one for distracting myself with phones in the middle of things, but it's based on a huge amount of science. It can do a lot of stuff, and as I've just mentioned, you can use it for good or ill. Okay, so you can use it in the middle of a talk to distract yourself, tweet it, just learned this good thing while you're missing the next good thing that the person is saying. Or you can phone home at the end of the day. You know, so there's good and well, you might disagree with me about uses of phones, but there's good ways to use technology and there are less good ways. So thinking about theology of science, a huge area is prayer and miracles. And I've put them together because trying to find a miracle, and we'll probably all come up with slightly different definitions, but things that happen when we interact with God and we ask for things, or he does things in our lives and in the world. Often there is a secondary cause that you can understand, that, for example, the Red Sea crossing, the wind blew all night and the people walked over. So, you know, there it is in the Bible. It tells you how it happened. That doesn't mean that God didn't do it, just because we understand how it happened. Sometimes we don't understand a secondary causal mechanism. The resurrection is the obvious one that I hope we all believe in if we're ministering in the church. And both types of interaction, of God interaction with the world, are actions of God. He's sustaining the whole thing. Both types of action further his causes, reveal his character, and help us to develop a relationship with him. So really, that's a very simple exploration of a very complex area, but we'll move swiftly on. I'll leave you with that. So it's the old mechanisms and meaning thing. So just because you understand the mechanism of why the kettle is boiling, physics, you could write me probably not a terribly interesting essay about how the kettle is boiling if you studied physics or chemistry at school. But we could also talk about the meaning. Most human beings, if you visit someone's house, will offer you something, a drink or a cup of tea or something. And you may not be thirsty, you may not like tea, you know, you may be whatever, but you're going to take it and you're going to have a drink together because it means so much more. We're way beyond science there. So thinking then, having with all that preamble about a theology of science, we believe at the Friday Institute that it's important to study creation, and I use the word creation in very generically. I'm not talking about any particular interpretation. I'm very happy with God's long. I believe that God created in a very long, slow way using the mechanisms we understand with science. I realize others have different views, but creation as in what God did to make the world. We study creation, what's out there, scientifically because it has value in and of itself. I think right throughout the Bible, you can see that creation is very good. It's fruitful, it's ordered, it's purposeful, it gives praise to God. So therefore, why not explore it? We should explore it. We study creation scientifically because God could have created any way he wanted to. This is the fancy word contingency. You know, it all relies on God. Nobody was telling him what to do. You can't sit there and predict what he should have done from first principles, as some philosophers tried to do. But we need to actually go out and look at it. So let's explore. And there are precedents there in the Bible. I've picked a couple on my slides. King Solomon, famous for trying to understand all sorts of things. The psalmists use their knowledge of the stars to help them praise God. Let's explore it. Now, of course, there's a lot of utilitarian value to science, and that's what scientists put down on their grant applications. But within a theology of science, you could say we can learn wisdom from looking at what's out there. And the wisdom literature will tell us all about that. We also need to tend and keep it. And how can we do that if we don't understand it? And then, like any form of employment or task, it's a crucible for character formation. It's got its own unique challenges and ways of forming, certainly my character as well, learning to deal with different kinds of stresses and pressures and working with people and sharing and all the ups and downs and highs and lows. And also, along with that, demonstrating Christ-like behavior in the world. And finally, for the Christian, as well as all that wonderful knowledge, it can fuel our worship. So when I look at this is a karyotype. It's a set of human chromosomes from a male. You can see the from a female. You can see a male. You can see the X and the Y down there. And we here. Sorry, I don't have a pointer. This is your little Y. There's not a lot on it, but some very vital genes for being man. And there's the X there, of which I have two. So that's the full set of human DNA. I think it looks like a nice set of stripy socks. That would make a nice Christmas present. You can have a whole lot of little pairs of socks that all look like different sizes, look like human chromosomes. Although the X and the Y wouldn't be quite such a useful pair of socks. And that, seeing that just fills me with wonder. It's about 2 meters if you stretched it all out in sort of real size of DNA. And that contains the instructions to build and maintain the human body. And that blows my mind. What a wonderful world we live in. So the theology of science goes hand in hand with a good theology of nature, which will obviously overlap a little bit with a doctrine of creation, but I think thinking about theology of nature, and I would do this rather than a natural theology, which comes with quite a lot of pitfalls. Maybe this is just a different way of explaining it, but anyway, I find this helpful. First of all, this is rooted in the fact that creation was done through Christ for him to rule and that all creation praises God. But the theology of nature is thinking about theology as a lens. So rather than looking at what natural theology would do, which would be looking at creation and saying, what can I learn about God from it? Which is not necessarily a bad thing to do, but it has to be done with great caution. But something I should say anyone can do is to take Christian theology or what one knows about Christianity and use it as a lens and look at the world and say, does it bring things into focus? Does it make sense of them? And I would say that for me, science is consistent with the existence of a loving, purposeful God. So it makes sense of, for example, the order we see in the world and the beauty. God has provided a place where we can predict what's going to happen. We can get on with our lives. There's a lot for us to use. It apparently has a beginning. I'm cautious with that because the physics is complicated. I don't understand it. The world is incredibly fruitful. It increases in complexity. These are very general things, but the fruitfulness, the beauty, the order, all the things we see around us make sense in the light of Christian theology. And of course, there's more than one way to look at the data. So you can look at it through other lenses. But then I'd say you should be looking beyond science as well for evidence of whether Christianity makes the most sense of the world. But anyway, looking at this theology of nature, if I look at, this is a temperate rainforest, this is a bit of Scottish woodland, which is fairly ancient, as undisturbed as things get in this country, and it was incredibly rich. Those mossy rocks were like jewels patterned with loads of different kinds of mosses and lichens. I'd never seen anything quite like it. I noticed my first slime mold there, which if you're a biologist is quite exciting. And it was humming with insects. So that I really, really was able to immerse myself in the fruitfulness of God's creation and imagine, gosh, just think what this would have been like, 6,000 years ago, before people arrived, and started mucking about with it. Just think what it would be like if, in a few hundred years' time, we applied our ecological knowledge and looked after things well. Wow. And that helps me to praise God. What a wonderful world you've made. So science, the type of scientific enterprise that we do in the West, has its origins at least partly in people's religious view of the world. Now, human beings are human beings. They've always investigated the world in lots of different ways. You just need to watch a toddler, and they're biting and chewing and poking and playing and tugging, and everything. They want to know how everything works. They're kind of doing experiments. Maybe you wish they wouldn't, but and people are religious. So it's the early scientists, the people several hundred years ago who were doing, well, they would have called it natural philosophy. They were nearly all people of faith, some of them very devout. And Christian theology contributed to the rise of science. I won't say much more. There are a few books on the bookstall or recommended on my little pile over there. You'll hear more about them over the next 2 days. But I'll give you one example of Johannes Kepler, who studied the elliptical orbits of planets, who said that our worship is all the more deep, I presume this is translated from Latin or another language, the more clearly we recognize that creation and all its goodness. Indeed, how many songs did David sing? He received the ideas for his songs from the admiring observation of the skies. So Johannes Kepler had originally wanted to be a theologian. They were the rock stars of the day. He was a bit disappointed he got offered a job in science, but he reconciled himself with it, saying, well, I can worship God through the things that I understand. Or a slightly more recent physicist, James Clerk Maxwell, who spent time in this university, as well as a number of others, who said, omnipotent God, who has created man in your image, and has made him a living spirit so that he can seek and have power over your creatures. Teach us to study the work of your hands in such a way that we can strengthen the earth to our use and subject the earth to our use and strengthen our reason in your service, and receive your blessed word so as to have faith in the one you have sent to give knowledge of salvation and the remission of our sins. Wow. That's quite a prayer, and that could come straight in a sense of a more modern version of the kind of thing Kepler was actually writing in his scientific publications. Now, by the time James Clerk Maxwell came along, that kind of wasn't okay. Science was a bit more diverse than that. And I like that people aren't judged by their religion when they go into science. I think it's good that people of all different kinds can do science. But I love that he can express his worship, his theology of science in that way. And I've done a certain amount of work on thinking how science can enhance our experience of Christian faith. I'll just mention 5 things just now. This is the beauty we see all around us, which can help us to reflect on the beauty of God himself. There's the creativity that we can express in trying to understand the world and use it around us, which is mirroring something of God's creativity. We can't make anything from nothing, but we can mirror a little bit of God's creativity. There's the sense of wonder, of curiosity, of always wanting to explore, that gives us, can feed our ongoing sense of wonder at who God is. There's the use of the imagination, which I've already mentioned in science, where we are, flourishing as human beings, using our imagination to understand the world around us and create mental pictures of what's going on, mental models of what's going on, constructing and testing against reality, which is exactly what we do with our theology. We're trying to understand who God is, and then we're bumping up against real experience. And there's a feedback loop in there helping us to form our mental images of who God is like. And then there's awe. Now I think, like beauty, I think our sense of wonder is a little bit of whatever floats your boat. I love drilling down into the details of how things worked. I've got a picture of a little bug here and guarding a beautiful pattern of all its eggs on a stem. And that kind of thing fills me with a sense of awe. But, it may be something else for you. But whatever gives us that standing still sense of surprise and slightly overwhelmed, where do we go with that? Where do we turn to with that sense of awe? So there's all sorts of ways in which science and faith can feed back into each other. And it's hopefully not a big surprise that there are lots of Christians in the sciences. And I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more facts and figures in our next talk, but I've gleaned a few from the census, a sort of a blunt sort of just belief in God. There are about slightly over 2/3 of the country, fewer among biologists and physicists, so there's clearly something going on there, but there's not none. Well over half of the people that this particular survey looked at were happy to say, yeah, I believe in some kind of God. And a number of them were attending weekly services. There's a slightly lower in relation to the rest of the population identification as sort of religious affiliation among scientists. I don't know what to put that down to. Maybe partly the curmudgeonly nature of academics and whether they want to affiliate with institutions, I'm not sure. But anyway, there's certainly far more Christians than scientists than we would sometimes be led to believe. Also, interestingly, when you're looking at scientists, you're looking at a really international population. Nearly half of them are born somewhere else. I don't know if that's got anything to do with whether they, if you believe in God or not, but anyway, there's a really interesting set of things going on there for Christians in the sciences. And they're people we should support, as we're going to hear, and I'll take a question at the end, if that's okay. The weekly attendance at religious services for the UK general population is the British Social Attitude Survey. And I should say, I'm going to mention a report by our next speaker, which outlines a lot of interaction between science and religion in this country, which will give you a lot of the background to this. But I just wanted to get that out there, that there are lots of people of faith in the sciences. So, just to summarize where I've been, Christian faith provides a really good framework for doing science well. The assumptions behind Christian faith and the theology of Christianity makes a lot of sense in the world of science. And science is a great way to enjoy, benefit from, serve creation. And it also enhances faith, although it does have limits, and rightly so. We can't expect everything of science, can't expect science to answer every question. So that's where I think, in my humble opinion, provides a good platform from which to engage with science in our churches, is a rigorous theology of science. And obviously there's far more one could go on to with reading and biblical studies if you have time to build some depth into that. But looking at how the church can engage with science just over the next short while. I'm going to give you, I think it's about six things that we can do. And I'm really not in favour of having to reinvent wheels or hire new staff people, invent massive programs. I think this kind of thing should just slip into what we're already doing with our churches. I mean, we may want to do special things from time to time, but I think the more it's just part of the routine, the more likely it's going to be sustainable. Being informed and equipped, we all bump up against the news in all sorts of different ways. Knowing where to go if we do want to find out more. I've mentioned a report by Nick Spencer, who's our next speaker, who works with Theos, who wrote a wonderful report drawing together a lot of the research that's been happening in this country, pointing out there's quite a big gaps in our knowledge of what people are thinking. And thankfully, they're doing a bit more research now so that we can find out sort of where our country is at. And I think for a church leader, it's great to know, what the underlying currents are, that when people are walking into our churches, what baggage they're bringing with them, at the very least. And then knowing where to go to find answers to questions. I've put the church's page on the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion website there, and in the next couple of months, spring 2020, if you're listening to the recording, there will be, around that time, we'll be launching a new Faraday website, and we'll have a section for churches on there where we'll refer to not just our own resources, but those of other organisations that we want to recommend. So being equipped, knowing where to go to find things out. Then there's also, this is a very easy one. I've put some beautiful pictures there. And reveling in the wonders as revealed by science. I don't think we need lots of lessons in how to do that. It's just leave it up to the creativity of the people serving the church. How can we draw in some of that sense of awe and wonder at the world around us in our services? Do we need to worship outside sometimes? It's a whole movement of people. There's a proliferation of books, one of which is on the stand over there, of sort of forest church or outdoor church type activities. Allowing people, encouraging people to explore and question. And I have a beautiful picture here of a slime mold. It looks like Christmas decorations, doesn't it? But if you're patient, if you're careful, if you pick the right spot, this was taken in the US, we have slightly more wilderness than we do, but I'm not sure we have any wilderness actually. But if you pick the right spot that's relatively unpolluted, undamaged, you can find some incredible things to explore. And giving people a chance to think about the areas of theology that inform our interaction with science, I think is important. So what is a well-developed doctrine of creation? How should we be caring for creation? What does it mean for me to be made in the image of God? What about the technologies that affect what we do with humankind? What's the fall? How did that affect the world around us? The difficult question of suffering that always comes up in this context. What happens when I pray? All these kinds of things. Not every people will have different questions, but there's probably someone in each of your churches, there will be people who are asking these questions, giving them a chance to look at the answers. Then there's also looking at the areas of science that inform our theology. What actually is evolutionary biology? What are the main principles there? Artificial intelligence, what can my phone do? Seriously, what's it doing with me as I use my smartphone? What's the technology behind that? What data are the companies I'm using gathering on me? And what wonderful things can it do? What difficult things does that pose? Can we understand ecology, what's going on in the world around us? What's happening in the stars? How are planets born? Could there be life on other planets? What about reproductive medicine? What technologies are there out there that we could use? Should we be using them? So allowing people to explore, to ask questions, to doubt, to really wrestle and test these things. It's also encouraging scientists. I've got a picture of a small girl who clearly wants to be a space explorer when she grows up, but not just prospective scientists, but also scientists in our congregations, and Andrew will talk about that tomorrow. But what a wonderful thing for people to grow up knowing that science is a great career for a Christian. I carry a little bit of baggage coming to choose my subjects in science, and I really wish I didn't have hang-ups. I might have chosen slightly different courses. So can we send kids out into the world confident that they can study science? That would be great. Can we use the scientists that are in our congregations and their knowledge? And then there's caring for creation, and I mean this in the very, very broadest sense. This includes people. We're part of creation. There's all sorts of ethical issues now to do with new technologies, to do with, I've already mentioned, artificial intelligence. Both of these things, very wonderful, very positive uses, also slightly scary potential uses. Can we encourage people to get into these areas, to do them well? Can we also be a voice in society? And there's also caring for the rest of creation, which is actually quite difficult to separate from human society, and I don't think we should. We're part of it. But certainly unnecessary habitat destruction, climate change, things like that. We're damaging things that have an intrinsic value, that are praising God, with also knock-on effect on human populations as well as the rest of creation. And then finally, there's the building of bridges outside of our churches. So sharing the positive view that we have of science and faith, discussing the big questions it raises. What about awe and wonder? Where does that take you? Where do other people go with that? Thinking about the beauty, what does it mean? Thinking about creativity, how do we use that? Where do you find purpose and meaning in the world? Discussing the issues, the objections to the relationship between science and religion. So all these things can be part of what we do with the church in society. So those are the ideals. Now, what's actually been happening? So we're lucky to interact with a number of churches around the country, around the world, and hear what they're doing. People send me in their stories, or I get to go and find out. So it's great. So I'll share some of them with you. First of all, if you have a lot of money, if you're doing a refurbishment or building a new building, some people have included scientific themes in their building to help people to praise God for the wonderful creation He's made. This one on the left is a picture of a lovely stone window, with a stained glass window with stone surroundings that have been carved with all sorts of shapes of animals and birds. And this is a chapel built by wealthy landowner Sarah Losh, who poured her time into creating a chapel, some of her time into creating a chapel that reflected so much of what we've learned about creation. Also in the middle, there's a image from a cathedral in Zurich where they've used slices through stone, through wonderful crystals, and used that instead of stained glass window, which I thought was incredible. And then there's quite a few churches now have stained glass windows with scientific themes in them, saying, God, this is your world. We're praising you with all these things we've learned about them. We don't all have that budget. Let's recognize it. In my church, which is a very fairly plain, ordinary looking warehouse, we had an exhibition, and I asked the scientists and engineers in my church to give me images. We printed them out on canvases, and they wrote something about how their work helped them to worship God. So that's a relatively easy way in which we can celebrate science in our churches, and then everyone who comes into the building sees that. We can do hands-on science. Grown-ups love it as well as kids. No doubt we'll hear more about that tomorrow, but I always try and encourage the adults to get involved as well. Messy Church Does Science is an absolutely fantastic resource, which links it in with biblical theological themes. So we can think as we play. It can be very low-key. It can be you with, as you can see one of these images, some paper plates and Smarties. Or you can do what some of us may have experienced, what Ely Cathedral has been doing with their wonderful science festivals, which are very high-powered. We can also fairly easily serve the whole church by having themed Sunday services. And there's some resources for that if you like to do a themed Sunday, or I and some friends have been going around various churches and doing family services, or doing sermons for the adults on science and faith and getting everyone involved in that. Others have been doing pilgrimages, walks around the area with people who know what they're talking about ecology or rocks or what have you, and tying in themes, Christian themes, as they go along through their journey through the natural world. There's another idea, something that can be done. Your only resource is a person who knows what they're talking about, and an area with some things to see. And then most churches will have small groups at some point during the year. We've got the Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book, written by Ruth Valerio this year, which is all about enjoying creation and creation care. You don't have to be an Anglican to use it. I'm sure the question is at the end of the chapters, and she's interviewed some very fascinating people. So those videos will be on the SBCK website in the next few weeks, I think. And also EcoChurch has produced and also listed small group resources of other people if you go to their website. I'm sure we'll hear about those from Dave Bookless tomorrow. And on the general science and faith side, we produced our own resource, Test of Faith, quite some time ago. Test of Faith, you can have a look at that. Ask me about that later. And then all of these resources are recommended on the churches, paid for churches, on the Faraday website. You can find details of their Why Are We Here wonderful series, which interviews scientists and philosophers. It's really suitable for groups that include people who aren't Christians as well. From the Dust goes into things all about creation and evolution, if that's an issue in your church. And there's a discussion guide to go with it. So there's all sorts of things for small group study, and an increasing number, actually. That's one thing that one can do relatively easily. You'll hear all about work for young people, so I won't mention young people's resources right now. But one thing that a number of churches have done is realize there's a lot of scientists on their doorstep if they have a science park, and they've started a ministry within the science park. The one thing I would say is it's really, really hard to prize enterprising scientists away from their desks and their lab benches for a talk. So it's very easy to attract church people to come, but much, much harder to get perhaps your target audience to come along, but let's keep trying. And there's a nice series, Parks at One, that happens in Cambridge, where we often supplying speakers for that. And finally, a lot of people will put on a talk. And you can have, if you want inspiration, you can look at the Wesley Methodist Church in Cambridge, look at their website and see all the speakers they've been having recently. If you're in the area, you could just invite all the same people. I think they're really good. Again, I say it is tough to reach your audience, to find the right speaker, day, time, advertise it in the right way, so you're not just reaching people that are just like you, because you think it's interesting, but trying to reach out. It's hard work, but when it's done well, it can work really, really well. You can get people coming along who have really tough questions about science and faith, and help them to work through them. It's very worthwhile. So those are just some of the things that are going on, all sorts of tailored for all sorts of different budgets. And I know that there are people here who've done some of them. So do chat to each other and find out what people have been up to. So just before we finish, I'm going to spell out what I do as Church Engagement Director, how I can serve you and your churches. So hopefully my aims have come across in my talk. What we really want to do is show that science works well within a Christian worldview, and encourage and equip you to engage with science in a helpful way. The kind of toolbox we're trying to use at Faraday among the team, setting out a very clear agenda of what we're trying to do, translating our material so it's approachable to people who aren't scientists, spelling out a theology that resonates with our audiences, being sensitive to different denominations and different churches, encouraging the people we meet, building relationships with them, finding out where they come from before we then start tackling the difficult questions, which may or may not be relevant within different contexts, with different sensitivities. Trying to provide accessible resources that are hopefully cheap or free. always trying to use hands-on science. It's, in a sense, it's a pain in the neck. It's messy. It takes time to set up. You end up having to bring a load of stuff with you, but it's a great way to get people engaged. Everyone likes playing. Doesn't matter how old you are. And also telling those stories about scientists who are people of faith. So that boils down, in a sense, to a few simple things. We can provide advice. You've got my card in your pack, so you can email me, you can phone me. We're providing training for leaders, as those of you who are here on this course will hopefully experience. We're reviewing the material that's out there. There is a lot. The science and religion literature is big. A lot of it's quite academic, but there are quite a few projects producing nice, accessible resources these days. We're producing some new material ourselves, and we're very happy to get stuck into talks and events. We will send speakers, I'll come myself, we'll preach, we'll do whatever is needed. So the kinds of things I'm stuck into at the moment, as I've mentioned, the new website that's coming, we're publishing things in popular publications, some of which you may get. We're collaborating with other people, which is great. We sometimes have to do very, very little to help reach a lot of people. We've got a new resource coming out, Wonders of the Living World, in October, an illustrated book. And we're involved in a number of national conferences and also training speakers. So those are the kinds of things we're doing. That's the sort of heart of my work at the Faraday Institute. I'll show you the website one more time, where you can find a resource document, and you have in your pack our Church Leaders Information Pack. I should say it's developing, it's in development, so if I've missed anything out, there's some essential details, do tell me, and I'll add it into the next version. So, before I finish and we go into questions, I'll just tell you that morning worship is in this lovely building here. If you walk out the front door, you'll see it. Just go in the front entrance, very simple, and I would like 5 people to read for me. So if you're feeling generous, come up to me in the coffee break and I shall write your name down. So, there we are, worshipping God with science, engaging in science in a church context. So, see if you've got any questions now.
And so now we have an opportunity to ask questions of Ruth, and so it's over to you.
On resources, do you have an expert would you like to use? Sorry, I'm Richard Hinder. Just a question about resources for churches and church leaders. You've used in your presentation quite a few very inspiring images. I wonder if you could make those and others available for copyright free, so to speak, for use by churches in presenting images of science in their services.
That's an interesting idea, actually, and the short answer for some of them, no, because they've been given to me for a specific project. For the images of stars and galaxies are from NASA. So what I could do, possibly on the church page, is to give a number of image libraries, details a number of image libraries where you can find images for that. That's a really good idea. Thank you. Stop writing these down.
Yes. Just 1 minute. We'll hand you a microphone.
Where did the divide start? Why?
Next talk, I think.
Right.
I suspect it's always been a question, about this. I don't know whether it's something that's intuitive in Western societies or whether it always has been for humans to think that, the less mystery, the less God there is. The more you know about the world, then less space there is for God to act. I don't know, but you'll need
to ask a question seems such a natural thing. So the very question of why one set of knowledge and one set of experience don't seem to tie together seems part of our fallen nature, if you like.
Yeah. I'll try not to steal our next speaker's thunder. He's going to talk all about conflict between science and religion. So, but yeah, it's such an important question. It's one that we all face.
Gentleman at the front.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
You spoke about, you showed us some figures about scientists and belief in God. We know that the belief in God can be simply a sort of philosophical proposition. And whereas, I mean, as a Christian, your next question is, well, what are you going to do about it? And that's the real issue there, isn't it? And whether that belief in God actually translates into something practical in life. And I just wondered whether you had any feeling for what figures might be for that secondary.
Right. Yeah. I think if one wanted to drill down, I think it would be the best to buy one of Elaine Howard Eklund's books, or she's got a number of papers online, some of which may be available if you don't have a university login. She's a sociologist who's done some in-depth interviews in this area. And again, our next speaker may have some information about that in his talk, I'm not sure. But Elaine Howard Eklund has done really detailed sociological studies of scientists' beliefs. And I think she has 2 books out with OUP with fairly generic titles about scientists and religion, I think. So, but I can look those up for you later if you want. Yeah. And then there's a gentleman here.
Gentleman in the middle.
I found myself inspired by your enthusiasm when talking about what gave you a sense of awe. Sometimes I'm a reader in the church, and sometimes I try and translate what I do in business as prayer. And I wondered, you talked about preaching and leading worship. Do you write things like collects, which are honed, accessible, but share that same sense of awe from a scientist's point of view?
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought. And there will be some in the 2. There's a resource that we've produced and a resource that one of our attendees, can Trevor raise his hand, please? So this chap has written some liturgies or liturgy for his own church, and they're linked on our website. But I'm not from a collect writing tradition, but no, it's an interesting thought to get a bunch of scientists.
It's not that complicated.
Write us something. Yeah.
It's just using the right words. When clergy try it, yes, they're well-meaning, but it's great to get the authentic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And especially if it sends you, the awe comes out.
Yeah, it's a really lovely thought. Yeah.
Julia, there's a couple of people at the back behind you.
Thanks. Well, thanks very much for your talk. I was really inspired by it. And I find myself sitting here quietly kind of nodding in agreement to just about everything that you said. But there was just one point that kind of bothered me, and it was right at the beginning when you put the slide up, when you said God is rational. And you sort of justified that by saying, well, we're all made in the image of God, as if somehow we're rational too. And I think we need to be very, very careful that we don't exaggerate the degree to which our own behaviour is determined by rationality as opposed to other forces. Really, I think it underplays the breadth of both human experience, but also of what God is.
Yeah. I mean, God is beyond rational as well, and so much of we do is beyond rational. But rationality is an aspect of our behaviour and God's character that is important. Yeah.
There's lots of very powerful, very persuasive evangelical atheists who seem to think that they're theologians. That I don't seem to get the same sort of strong answer from the theologians who are arguing back on the grounds with science. In other words, the scientists come over and talk about theology. I can't find the theologians who are coming over and talking about science.
There are a few who you can look out for who are doing things. Part of the problem is they're not given the same platform. So they're out there and some excellent people, but they're not often willing to use the same language that is grabbing headlines. So if you look for Alistair McGrath, he gets a lot of profile. If you Google him, if you look for John Polkinghorne, he's not doing so much in public anymore, but there's a lot of his stuff online. And obviously, if you look at the books on the bookstall, that there are people there who are out there who are doing things. And all I can say is, if you do have access to yourself, if you're controlling some kind of media outlet, you can come to us if you like. We're very willing to speak and find theologians or find scientists or people of faith. But it can be the conflict narrative, and again, this will come up in the next talk, is so popular, and for whatever reason, unless you're willing to say something that sounds, okay, my cynicism going to come across it now. You could feel as if, unless you're willing to say something a bit wacky or shouty, then you're not going to get the platform. But I'm sure it's more nuanced than that. But yeah. And if anyone knows any up and coming theologians who really want to be involved, again, let us know. We're always looking for new voices to encourage. So, yeah.
Thank you. Gentleman here, Julia.
Yeah.
Can you keep putting your hand up? Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you. I wonder if you see any trends across the generations. So if we look at older people through to middle to the young kids, what's the projection of travel in terms of the way they see the world and the things that are issues for them in this space?
Oh, that's really interesting. Again, I'm not a sociologist. You'll have to ask the next speaker again. In fact, all the speakers will have their own perspective on this, especially the youth and schools director who's speaking tomorrow. From my own perspective, I think there's always a lot of interest. It's never hard. For example, if you give a talk at a Christian conference, it'll always be rammed. There'll always be people there. I think often the same questions are coming up. They'll be articulated different ways. They're often questions about human identity and things that affect human identity. For Christians, it depends which tradition they're coming from, but things that really impact on their tradition, whether it's their understanding of the Bible or of creation or of the human self. I think, how are things changing? I think probably what affects my work more is more just general demographics of how do people engage with this kind of material. If you give a talk, the audience is often older, but obviously if you put something on Facebook or other social media platforms, you're going to reach more of the demographic who use that social media platform. If you put out a podcast, it will reach much wider people. So we're constantly trying to find ways of reaching the people who have the questions, but they just may not have the time or the inclination, or they take in information in different ways. So we're just trying to figure out how to serve people best.
Can I just add to that? Because we've started doing 1 or 2 Faraday courses overseas recently, and although the demographic of many of our conferences in the UK is older, in Africa and in China recently there were loads of young people, which was really pleasing to see.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got another 5 minutes for questions. So if you've got questions, yes, gentleman at the back.
Thank you very much for your talk, Ruth. Good start to the course. As a scientist with faith, I get the whole idea of awe, and it certainly has changed as I've gone on my faith journey. But in ministry, I also come across a lot of people without a scientific background who can actually find it more scary than awe-inspiring in terms of the impact that it has on their faith. And so how would you approach those sort of people?
I think the kind of story I've just told is very encouraging to that type of person. So this kind of talk I've just given, it's in a training context, but I'll give similar messages in a church as sort of first contact. This is the first thing I do. This is how science and faith interact. And I would pepper it with far more quotes and videos and things of people who are scientists or people of faith, and then get the people in the congregation who are scientists or people of faith to identify who they are and give people a chance to chat to them. And so it's sort of outing the, what's actually happening, so that they know that the real story, yes, there's conflict, and, we have different views, different ideals, different aims, so there will be between Christians and people who aren't. And science is one of those places that will happen. And every new technology will bring up discussions that we need to have, and people who want to use it in ways we don't agree with. So there are conflicts, but I think the basic premise is so positive. When you drill essentially, it's history and philosophy and theology of science, you know, is where you need to start, I think. And then if people still have questions and worries, then it can come up and be addressed. But I think this is a really good foundation to lay. And if, you know, you write your own collects, you know, then they've got that, you know, that lovely demonstration of science and faith there happening in the church. But I don't tend to start by talking about the conflict, because that's not where everybody is, and I don't want to perpetuate it if it's not there. So, yeah.
Thank you. The lady here has a question.
It was less of a question and more of an observation. I don't know if people know that during the Extinction Rebellion in London, in Trafalgar Square, they put up a big tent and had a communion service. And it was the day when all the tents and everything were being thrown into the road by the police because they'd had enough. But the police acknowledged that that was important and allowed people to have their communion service.
Yeah, good.
Thank you.
Yeah, those Christians getting stuck in. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Okay, probably time for one more question if somebody has a burning question.
Or an experience, if you've been. Oh, yeah, I think there's a.
Thank you. Just one general question. Just thinking about social media. Wonder what your view is on how that's affecting the way the public relate to science and the issues of science and faith, and where truth lies.
I mean, again, I think this is our next speaker's area of expertise. But I suspect there's nothing new under the sun, but it may go around faster, and in a less informed way, because it's so easy to be soundbitey with social media. But even the less informed part might not be true, because it's pretty easy to get nicely informed if you've got the whole internet, you know, if you're discerning enough. So I think the speed of travel of things and the ease of travel of ideas is really, and also the possibly the cheapness, the ability at very low cost to produce fake news or things that aren't true, is possibly also makes it difficult. But I just, you know, get stuck in. You know, we have a social media feed from Faraday. I have from the Work for Churches, and just putting it, adding, you know, just adding our voice to what's happening in all different kinds of media, print, blogs, you know, audio, video. You know, it's great. It's great to use the resources that are out there and be part of the discussion. So, yeah, there's great opportunities there.
Okay, well, we'll take a break there. Thank you, Ruth, very much for a stimulating talk. And Ruth is going to be around through the conference, and so plenty of chance to talk to her.